Hey, let me tell you something I discovered. I've discovered that most people, at least in my experience, because people say, Darius, what do you mean most people? You don't know most people. When I say most people, this is anecdotal, okay? I'm talking about people in my world, people that I've served and am serving. Most people have a tough time having tough talks. Yeah, most people have a tough time having tough talks. You got some who have a tough time having the tough talk at all, right? And so that person might be a bit passive aggressive. Now, I'm not demonizing that. I'm just describing that. I think describing something isn't demonizing it. Many people kind of fall in that department where it's just really difficult for them to have tough conversations. And so their offense, their irritability, them being upset kind of comes out in interesting ways. It comes out in jokes or side comments, right? So you have that one category, just have a difficult time having a conversation at all. Then there's the other side, right? Which might not be passive aggressive, might be like hyper aggressive. And on this side, this group doesn't necessarily have a problem having the conversations. They just don't have them well. They do them without a lot of intentionality. They do them without empathy. They do them sometimes not taking into consideration the feelings of the other person. And of course you can't and should be controlled by other people's feelings, but you should be conscious of them. I think that's important. And so this is what I want you to know. Like, if I'll put it this way, the road to real relationships is a road that requires difficult conversations, right? At some point, there's going to have to be some tough talks. And why? It's simply because we're in relationships. And when I'm talking about relationships, I'm not just talking about like romantic relationships. I'm talking about professional relationships. I'm talking about family relationships. I'm talking about platonic relationships. I'm talking about spiritual relationships, like people that you're in relationship with because you share the same faith. All of those people are imperfect. And what does that mean? If you're in relationship with someone long enough, at some point, you're going to be impacted by their imperfection. What does it mean? It means that sometimes they're not going to say something right. They're not going to do something right. And I'm not saying that this is going to happen in every relationship you have, because some of you might be watching this. You're like, yo, Darius, I've got some relationships where I never feel like I've had to have a tough conversation with that person. We just vibe together and I feel like we understand each other. Right. So of course there are exceptions and anomalies, but I am saying at some point in your relational orbit, specifically when you're talking about romantic relationships and even more specifically marital ones, the road to real relationships. When I say real, I'm talking about intimacy. And when I'm talking about intimacy, I'm talking about a close relationship based on who you really are, not who you are pretending to be for the purpose of maintaining false peace. Now, that's a completely different teaching that I need to do there, right? When people are repressing, I'm not talking about being prudent and being strategic, but that's different. I don't think you should say I think you should only say what's true. I don't think you should say everything that's true all the time. So having some restraint, which everybody needs to have, is different than repressing who you are. Think about that for me. It's one thing to say like, yeah, I need to have some restraint. It's another thing to be in a situation where you feel like, man, I'm repressing who I am. Like I have to be someone other than me, or I've got to be a specific version of me to actually be in this relationship. It might be a relationship, but it's going to feel more like a prison than a palace. Maybe a pretty prison. Yeah, but the road to real relationships, intimacy, where there's closeness based on who you really are, not who you pretend to be, can't happen without tough talks. Because at some point in some relationships that matter to you, there's going to be some offense. And some offense can't go unaddressed, because and you have to make the determination. I talk a little bit about this in relational intelligence, right? Every offense doesn't need to be addressed. But there are some offenses that are an expression of a person's behavior. And if that's not addressed, they're not going to change the behavior. And if they don't change the behavior, then there's going to be the accumulation of offenses. It's like, yo, it's one time for you to kind of hurt or offend me once. It's another thing for me to know that every time we get together, every time we connect together, that I'm about to have to deal with some of this. And sometimes some relationships, and I'm not just talking about romantic relationships, some relationships end and they don't have to. They end because offense wasn't managed properly. Now, do I think all relationships are supposed to last forever? No, man. There's something called necessary endings. To everything, Ecclesiastes says, there is a season and a time to every purpose under heaven. And so there are going to be times where things just need to end, right? I need to end the toddler phase. I need to end the adolescent phase to go into adulthood, right? Things need to end. There has to be necessary endings so that there could be new beginnings. So I'm not talking about those things. I'm talking about relationships that probably could have been salvaged if we learn to manage offense a little differently. So maybe you're on one of these extremes. Maybe you're like, yo, I'm the one that doesn't really like to have these conversations, so I'll just accumulate the offense and just deal with it in my own way. Or you're one that recognizes, I have these types of conversations all the time. I probably need to be a little more strategic about them. Or maybe you feel like, I handled these perfectly. I don't need this video, Dharius. Well, maybe some things I'm about to share now, maybe they're not helpful for you. Maybe they'll add value to someone else. And so maybe as you hear what I'm about to say, it might give you language and a different perspective to kind of help someone else. You know, I was reading something one time by Henry Cloud, and he was talking about difficult conversations. And he said something that was so strong. It was really perspective altering for me. I wrote it down. I'm going to share it with you. He said, delaying difficult conversations only makes them more difficult. Because, you know, sometimes I'm like, I'm going to get around to it. I'm going to do it. I'm going to get around to it. He's like, delaying difficult conversations only makes them more difficult. This is what he says. He says, number 2, when you wait to handle bad behavior, it's like waiting until manure accumulates to shovel it. Shoveling is easy when it's smaller. Whoa, that's a real raw example. And here's the third thing. He says, growing anything. And so when I say anything, I'm talking about relationships here. A marriage, a professional relationship, a spiritual relationship, you name it. He says, growing anything requires growing people. And people can't grow without tough conversations. So real quick, let me give you 3 tips for tough talks, if that's cool. And I want to share with you something. I know you've heard of the FBI. I want to give you the SBI. These are tips for tough talks. The SBI. Here it is. Schedule a conversation and describe the setting. That's the S. Schedule a conversation and describe the setting. And so when I say schedule it, that doesn't necessarily mean like set an appointment with the person. Like, yo, I want to talk to you tomorrow at 7 p.m. But it means that in your head, you've made a decision that I'm going to have a conversation, right? Right? You don't just have priorities, you schedule your priorities, and this conversation is a priority. And in your head, you got to make a decision. All right, I'm going to schedule this. And when you schedule the priority, right, You describe the setting. You let them know. You describe the setting that the offense occurred in. When we were on the phone, or when we were in the place, or when we were on the trip, when this happened, you describe the setting for them so that they can remember. All right? But you not only describe the setting, let's go to the B. You describe the behavior. Very specific, right? Not motives. We're not talking about motives. We're just describing the behavior. When we were here, you did this. So you're not even making a judgment on what they did. You're just describing what they did. And then here comes the I. The I is when you describe the impact that had on you. So S, you schedule the conversation, and you describe the setting. So schedule and setting, that's the S. So you reminded them we were here. B, this is what happened. Specific behavior, no judgment. You were wrong for this. No, not yet. Describe the behavior. And then I, this is the way that impacted me. It made me feel this way. It cost me this. It cost me that. Now, everything after that is out of your control. But you can rest knowing that you did everything that you could to articulate where you were, what happened, and how it impacted you. And if it's a person that's emotionally healthy and loves you well, they love me, but are they loving you well? Then they're going to respond at least with empathy. Even if there's not agreement, and even if there's not understanding, there's going to be empathy. And I think that's the key that unlocks the door to real relationships. All right. Hope that helped. Tips for tough talks.